evening to all of you. Thank you so much for those warm words of introduction. It's indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here at the Center for Public Policy Research to speak before all of you today on a policy for India in Asia, or Asia policy for India. I'm going to begin with conceptualizing the idea of India in Asia. And I think the concept of what India means to Asia and where we stand in Asia must begin with an understanding of India's multi-layered geography, its northern frontiers that touch the Eurasian heartland of Mackinder's definition, its rimland position in Eurasia with China, and its natural endowment of oceanic space, and you in Kerala know that well, through clear, unhindered peninsular access to the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, and the Indian Ocean. India is thus a natural place for arrival in Asia. It is omnidirectional because it conjoins both East and West, those two famous twins of history. What is often forgotten is that through much of recent history, before the end of the Second World War, there was no distinct boundary between India and Southeast Asia. During the Second World War, the Japanese invasion of Asia stopped at the eastern land boundaries of India, and a Southeast Asia command was set up under Lord Mountbatten of Burma in Kandy in Sri Lanka. And the unbounded space of historical contact, the movement of people, trade and commerce, spiritual thought, culture and ideas as it had existed through centuries, linking India through the Bay of Bengal with old Burma, Malaya and Singapore ceased to be. This point has been very well elaborated in a most interesting book written by the Harvard University scholar Sunil Amrit called Crossing the Bay of Bengal. Last year, another Harvard scholar and academic, the renowned Nathan Glazer, in a letter to the New York Times, joined the ongoing debate on whether the term South Asia should replace India in school textbooks. His view was that the region that we now call South Asia was what was generally referred through history from the Greeks and Alexander onwards until the era of British imperialism as India, a distinctive civilization, as he called it, stretching from the Indus to the Ganges, from the Himalayas to the Indian Ocean. I have cited Nathan Glazer just to remind ourselves of the necessity to study the history, especially in the modern era of India, to understand the imprint of Indian migration, Indian labor, Indian entrepreneurship, and in the 20th century of India's freedom movement and its constitutional democracy on the making of what we term as Southeast Asia today, mainly made up of the countries of the ASEAN. The oceanic space that surrounds India was the quintessential mare liberum of Hugo Grotius, whose words I quote, "For do not the ocean navigable in every direction with which God encompassed the earth, and the regular and occasional winds which blow, offer sufficient proof that nature has given to all peoples a right of access to all other peoples," unquote. The seas surrounding India provided an interconnecting space, unhampered by modern definitions of sovereignty. They were human seas, bridges of ideas, of trade, of capital, and allowing the free passage of ships in a polyglot world. This was where India located itself in Asia through interaction and interdependence, as many scholars have noted. Undivided India, before 1947, projected a physical and security presence that stretched from the Suez to Singapore. The post-1947 scenario witnessed a fragmenting of that geography and the appearance of the territorial divisions that define the South Asia of today. For a brief period in the mid-20th century, the leaders of newly independent India and nations like Indonesia, Burma, and China sought to define an identity for Asia based on ideas of coexistence embedded in their age-old cultures of peaceful interaction and syncretic traditions. One still recalls the logo of the 1955 Bandung Conference that pictured a dove of peace over the Indian Ocean. These were nascent dreams populated with compelling ideas of cooperation, but ultimately rivalries and competition, contest and conflict, unknown in the Asia of history, subsumed the urge to create a truly integrated continent. But we live today in the age of collapsing distances and the growing inability of hitherto impregnable frontiers to withstand the impact of regional conflict, refugee flows, environmental pollution and degradation, natural disasters, and the interconnected state of global finance and economies, as well as the threat of transnational terrorism. This is a multiplex world, as the Washington-based academic Amitav Acharya terms it. What applies to the world applies equally to Asia, even as it becomes a major contributor to global GDP, has vastly increased its share of global trade, and is crucial to the maintenance of global economic equilibrium. A vast proportion of the world's population today is Asian, much of the share coming from India and China. Any discussion on Asia today brings into focus the re-emergence of China and India. We have been witness to the trajectory of China's rise to leading power status in the global arena, though there still remain valid questions about what China's destiny will be and what the future holds for it. That in itself need not offer consolation to India, which has distances to cover in its development agenda, and its economic rise, although its economic growth rate today is greater than China's and highest among the major world economies. But it would seem that China did move with greater alacrity than India in achieving closer integration in the Asia-Pacific over the last 3 decades. Speaking in New Delhi in March 2016, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that India pursues a flexible geometry in its cooperation initiatives in Asia. He said India had integrated in different ways and at different speeds with our neighbors in South Asia, with ASEAN and with Singapore, Japan and South Korea. Mr. Modi spoke of India's special place in Asia and how it had a lasting influence on the culture of the continent. But the challenges are there and they must be addressed with reason and strategic vision. India's special place in Asia cannot be denied, but in order to ensure it, the call for greater regional integration, connectivity, consolidating national development, economic liberalization, infrastructure creation, and ease of doing business must be fully addressed. The Act East policy that replaces India's Look East policy seeks to define the country's identity as a multi-regional presence. For instance, seen from the Andaman Islands, Malaysia is closer than the southeastern coast of India, and northeastern India is from the viewpoint of ethnicity, language, and historical connectivity naturally linked to Southeast Asia. In fact, India's northeastern states have been drawn in as active players in the Act East policy, whose linchpins as our government states are commerce, connectivity, and culture. There is certainly a greater sense of urgency today in India's outreach to East and Southeast Asia. This flexible geometry that Mr. Modi speaks of includes, for instance, high-level bilateral visits, a stress on security, defense, and counterterrorism collaboration, enhanced trade and investment, innovation and technology flows, and greater allocation of resources for connectivity. There is a dynamic growth of relations with Japan and a deepened orientation towards countries like South Korea and Mongolia, besides Australia, Fiji, and the Pacific Island nations. Our relations with the United States, which sees itself as a Pacific power with a strategic outreach into the waters of Asia, have been redefined in the last decade. The advent of the Trump administration has, of course, introduced new dimensions in the worldview of the United States and issues of trade, immigration, and of an America that looks inward rather than to a reaffirmation of its role as a global leader for the 21st century, have assumed center stage. It is, of course, still early to say that the strength and substance of the India-US strategic partnership as it has evolved in the last decade will be diluted in any way in a Trump era. Our defense collaboration with the United States is more than likely to be maintained and to accelerate further. This is a collaboration that has grown very significantly, with equipment purchases that make the US our leading defense supplier, joint exercises, and the Defense Trade and Technology Initiative. Likewise, there can be no dispute that a stable, secure, and prosperous Indo-Asia Pacific region is in the interest of both India and the United States. Ensuring security of sea lines of communication, since $5.3 trillion of global trade passes through the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, is vital to our nations. Geography is destiny, and India cannot escape that certitude. India in Asia must deal with the challenge of both its China relationship and its South Asian neighborhood. India's competitive coexistence with China, as some call it, entails the maintenance of a steady equilibrium in its relationship with its biggest neighbor. The relationship has only grown in complexity and weight over the last decade. Its economic component is hefty, while its security-related aspects have not diminished in terms of their potential to cause instability or tension along the long territorial border the two countries share. The pattern of the last 4 decades, where peace and tranquility was maintained in the border areas between the two countries, will take effort and focus to be preserved and maintained. With no solution to the border question in sight, ensuring peace on the frontier is a crucial priority. We can, of course, in the question and answer session, discuss this aspect further. China's heightened assertiveness in the projection and consolidation of its territorial claims in the East and South China Seas and its naval reach into the Indian Ocean have become issues of constant focus for most countries in the region. As one observer puts it, in many ways the boundaries between South Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia have never been more tenuous. The need for a code of conduct in disputed waters and for a security framework, an architecture that enables reasoned dialogue and settlement of disputes through negotiation has never been greater. The question is sometimes asked if China's launch of the One Belt, One Road initiative is a new edition of a great game. The jury is still out on this. One explanation is that China's excess production capacity, its infrastructure building surplus, and its financial resources, together with need for a steady and uninterrupted flow of energy resources to fuel its economic requirements, make it hungry for multidirectional accessibility. But there is also the factor of its phenomenally enhanced military strength in recent years that has become a vector for Chinese nationalism and assertiveness in the neighborhood. How are all these impulses going to be reconciled with the legitimate security concerns of the countries that exist in the region? Here again, flexible geometry in India's approach has seen its joining the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank launched by China although the approach to the One Belt, One Road is more nuanced and hedgy. The fact of China-Pakistan strategic cooperation and a close military relationship that supplements the economic corridor that will connect Xinjiang with Gwadar port in Balochistan and which will run through Indian-claimed territory currently occupied by Pakistan in Kashmir complicates matters. On the other hand, India and China are collaborating within the Bangladesh-China-India-Myanmar initiative to enable better surface connectivity that will help greater trade flows, people-to-people ties, and ease of doing business. India's other neighborhood relations are with its South Asian cohorts, and here the situation remains fluid. The regional integration example provided by ASEAN is far from being comprehensively accomplished here, mainly because of the absence of normalization in India-Pakistan relations, although gradually we are seeing greater sub-regional cooperation and connectivity being pursued within the region, despite this between India and its other neighbors. While India's unsettled border with China and the dispute with Pakistan over Kashmir are still far from being settled, there is every need, in my view, for all the countries involved in this to evolve a consensus that determines that pending a final settlement of these disputes, a modus vivendi that enables disputed regions to live normal lives, that protects the environment of what is essentially a sacred geography, enshrined through custom, culture, and tradition, and which enables tourism, conservation of water and forest resources, connectivity and commerce be made possible. At a recent conference in Kathmandu, Nepal, the idea has been floated of a Himalayan consensus that would work towards this goal, utopian as it may seem to many of us at this time. As I look ahead at the future of Asia, I cannot but conclude, however, that the best prospects for peace and progress in the region are ensured by a focus on interlocking patterns of cooperation involving the United States, India, and China. This is particularly so for the Indian Ocean. Countries like Japan and Australia, together with ASEAN leaders like Indonesia, Singapore, and Vietnam, cannot be excluded from these processes to bring about a reduction of tensions. China's integration into such a process poses a challenge, but it must be addressed. Otherwise, our vision of the Indo-Asia Pacific as an uninterrupted space of cooperation, unhindered commerce, freedom of passage, maritime security, and sustainable development cannot be realized. There is one more aspect that I thought I should touch on. The question is often asked, is there a notion of a concert of Asia? The answer is negative. A strategy for Asia has to be rooted in principles, not designs. A concept of security for Asia has to be about ensuring peace. It has to be about balancing interests and not about geopolitical activism. An open and inclusive, transparent and balanced security and economic architecture for the region can help cement relationships, avoid conflict, and promote security with economic growth and development for Asia. Western concepts of balance of power may not strictly apply here. Universal humanistic ideals are very much native to the Asian tradition, as is the cosmopolitanism that connected the peoples of the Asian continent and the Indian Ocean through millennia. Modernization can coexist with Eastern values and need not be tied to Westernization. In discussions of our outlook on Asia, there is usually little focus on Islam and its Asianness. Islam's arena of growth and evolution was Asia, the Asia of the Indian subcontinent, of Central Asia, and the Straits of Malacca. The largest Muslim communities in the world live in Indonesia and India, and these communities are known for their syncretic traditions and the manner in which they have assimilated local tradition and cultural influences. The words of India's nationalist leader, Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad, are particularly revealing and meaningful. I quote, "I am a Muslim and proud of this fact. Islam's splendid traditions of 1300 years are my inheritance. In addition, I am proud of being an Indian. I am part of the indivisible unity that is Indian nationality. Islam has now as great a claim on the soul of India, on the soil of India, as Hinduism. It was India's historic destiny that many human races and cultures and religious faiths should flow to her, and that many a caravan should find rest here. One of the last of these caravans was that of the followers of Islam. 1100 years of common history have enriched India with our common achievement. Our languages, our poetry, our literature, our culture, our art, our dress, our manners and customs, the innumerable happenings of our daily life, everything bears the stamp of our joint endeavors. There is indeed no aspect of our life which has escaped the stamp." Unquote. The Islam of the East, therefore, embraces the local traditions of its country of adoption. Islamic civilization has thrived in lands beyond Arabia, its actual place of birth. The florescence of Islam, as many scholars have defined it, took place mainly in Asia, and in India, may I add. The Turco-Mongols converted to Islam and established empires in Iran, in Turkey, and in India. Their rule nurtured rich literary traditions and glorious architecture, including the Taj Mahal in Agra, India, and the Registan of Samarkand. Islam is firmly established in Southeast Asia. It is truly an Asian religion today, as the words of Maulana Azad, quoted above, so eloquently illustrate. Islam's heartland, therefore, is Asia. Indonesia is the largest Muslim country, and India, with a Muslim minority, has the second largest population of Muslims in the world. The largest concentration of Muslims in the world is in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. No study of Islamic diversity would be complete without the study of the Sunnis, the Shias, the Sufis of the South Asian subcontinent. Sufi Islam in India particularly has incorporated into its devotionals ancient Hindu and Buddhist festivals and sites of pilgrimage. And Islam is also vital for the understanding in India of Central Asia, an area often neglected for the study of Islamic traditions because of its long association with the Soviet Union. In India, we call the Middle East West Asia and North Africa. Political Islam, as we see resurgent in the Middle East or West Asia today, is not a strange phenomenon for us from the South Asian subcontinent. Pakistan is a creation of political Islam, where religion is seen as bound with the state and not separate. Islam in Pakistan has increasingly sought to infuse elements of religious practice and influence drawn from West Asia in its intent to create an Islamic identity that is more than South Asian and less connected to its Indian past. The idea of Pakistan is one often expressed as an antithesis to India, and this struggle to define itself has come at a tremendous cost to Pakistan in terms of stability and development. Asia's future is also bound to be impacted by the unfolding developments in Syria and in areas within Iraq, as we have seen over the last decade. The rise of the Islamic State of ISIS and its murderous militancy is watched by Muslim youth worldwide. This rejection of the Western and the emphasis on the Islam of the desert, of the fundamentalist and radical movements like Salafism and Wahhabism, as also the struggle for the soul of Islam between Saudi Arabia and Iran, is bound to have reverberations in the hitherto more tolerant and less rigid and orthodox Asian Islamic communities in Central, South, and Southeast Asia, excluding Pakistan. So building that best balance is what the Asia policy for India can be about. We are being buffeted by many winds today, not just the winds of globalization, but by influences that come to us from all quarters. Traditional societies here in our own country are moving from rural to urban settings and very often are quite overwhelmed by the forces of change. So Asia itself exists on the cusp of these changes. One hopes that the traditions of tolerance and inclusiveness that have been unique to us as an Asian country and to the continent at large for all these centuries will serve us well in the future ahead. It's the inner reserves of strength and resilience, that emphasis on dialogue and mediation, that are the best natural defenses against radicalism and intolerance, and against the rise of terrorism and non-state actors. A rising, resurgent Asia, that giant banyan tree, as some call it, must show it can turn back this regressive tide, and I believe that is where India should take the lead. We cannot be indifferent. We are increasingly more integrated and hence less sheltered. The civilizational identity of India must be emphasized rather than a civilizational identity for one religion or one faith, or a transnational attempt to impose such a vision of an imagined community from outside. The makers of 21st century Asia, and indeed the makers of our Asia policy, have formidable tasks ahead of them.